and welcome to the University of Bristol's Faculty of Arts channel. Today we're here with Associate Professor Lesel Dawson and PhD researcher Rachel Hare to discuss their ongoing project on grief and creativity. Thank you both for joining me today. Firstly, I understand that this is a wider project on grief and creativity, so can you tell us a bit about the wider research project?
Sure. And just to say thank you so much, Alice, for having us on. It's great to be able to talk about this. So the project is called Creative Grieving, and it explores the therapeutic potential of creativity and the way that art can help us to express and process loss. So really the project is looking at the dual role that the imagination plays in grief. So on the one hand, the imagination can be a source of suffering. So when someone's died, we will think about the person who's died, we long for them. We might keep remembering their death or imagining it, and we grieve the loss of our imagined future together. So it's a source of suffering. But also the imagination is a really important tool for processing grief. So the imagination helps us to maintain our connection to the people who have died, to renegotiate our relationship with them and integrate them into our life. So the imagination has this kind of, it can cause us pain, but it can also help us to accommodate loss. And the wider aims of the project are really to explore this relationship between grief and creativity, and also to engage the public in these conversations.
And so what prompted you to undertake this research in this project?
So a couple of different things. From an academic point of view, I have a long-standing interest in the history of the emotions and psychology. So my first book was on lovesickness. I've also written about and researched shame, disgust, revenge, trauma. So in some ways it fits into a wider set of interests. It also comes from my work with Lucy Selman on the Good Grief Festival, which is a virtual online festival. We've been doing it since 2020, so it's quite new. Lucy is the leads on this, and it was initially funded by the Wellcome Institute, but it brings together psychotherapists, palliative care workers, artists, writers, all to talk about grief and loss and to share stories. So it also sort of is part of that. And the final motivation really is personal. Like most people, I've experienced grief and loss. It's probably not surprising that when I was in my 20s, I read about love and desire. And now as an older person, I'm thinking much more about death and about grief. I want to be able to face my own death in a good way. And I want to help my children live really happy, flourishing lives in a world of impermanence, in a world of grief and loss.
That's really interesting. What kind of methods have you used or are you using to carry out the research?
So it has a couple of different methods. It has traditional scholarly research methods. So I'm looking at, articles, books about grief and the relationship to creativity. I'm looking at experiments that have been done on different kinds of interventions, like how does keeping a journal impact the grieving process, and scholarship about the imagination. So what are the roles, for example, that the role that images play in emotion and in memory, so things like that. I'm also considering people's personal stories of grief. So as part of the Good Grief Festival, I'm arts and culture lead. I get to interview photographers, artists, writers who've experienced grief and who've turned to creativity to process their loss. So thinking really about the kind of role that creativity plays for them. And finally, there's a component that is called practices research, which is where you actually engage in activities as a form of research. So with Jimmy Hay in film and an artist, Natasha Roslane, we made a very short fiction film about grief. And we drew on our own experiences of loss, also interviews with people who are grieving. And we came together and wrote a short fiction film called Lost Property. So that was a kind of process where we were both the subject of research as well as doing the research. So we thought about the way that our own stories, memories changed through the creative process. So kind of lots of different little components.
Mm-hmm. So following that, what kind of outputs have you produced so far?
Okay, so the short film, which has been edited, so the fiction film, that's called Lost Property, so watch out for that. I'm currently writing a book called Creative Grieving, Art, Loss, and the Imagination. So that's the more kind of scholarly output. We've also made two other films. One is a short animation about children, grief, and creativity. And that is a collaborative work with Julia Samuel MBE, who's a well-known psychotherapist and best-selling author, and with the animator and widower, Gary Andrews, and myself. This animation is trying to think about what are the key things that you can do to support children when they are grieving, and also how does creativity help children to express grief. So it's short, it's 3 minutes, it has lovely animations, and it sort of pulls together the research and life experiences of everybody contributing. Rachel, who's here today, who's worked with me a lot on this project, also helped with the animation. I don't know, Rachel, if you want to say anything about that or the process.
Yeah, I think what was really exciting about the animation was that video is such an interesting way to deliver information. So the project really developed. We started with this very thorough academic script, which covered all the bases of how children grieve. But we found that when we put that with Gary's drawings, and like Lesel says, they're beautiful, we just didn't need so many words. The images, they kind of carry the research. So we pared back the script to really focus on what was necessary to get the information across. And Lesel and Gary added music, they added other voices. And they've ended up with this output, which will hopefully be really engaging and accessible and useful for people dealing with grief.
And finally, we're working on a policy paper on grief education in school, which we're going to talk about more, I think.
Yeah, so the policy paper is the current phase of the project, isn't it? And so what are the kind of key arguments?
So the key message of the policy paper is that grief education should be introduced into school as part of the compulsory primary school syllabus. So this is the kind of big argument we want to make. Child Bereavement UK estimates that 1 in 29 of 5 to 16-year-olds have been bereaved of a parent or sibling. I mean, this is a lot of kids. And according to a 2016 survey, only 1 in 10 British adults bereaved as a child said that their school was very supportive at the time of bereavement. So we feel that a change, we need a change now to support children and also to change the culture about death and grief. We teach, we teach about birth, we teach sex education. Death is another part of life. Grief is another part of life. And I think it's really not helpful, or not as helpful. It is helpful, but it's not ideal. Let me put it that way. There's lots of good things out there, but you don't really want grief education kind of helicoptered in when there's a bereavement. You don't want that child who's lost a parent to feel singled out or exposed in some way. Really, you want grief education embedded in the education system. So every kid can start learning how to talk about it, how to support other people, and how to be ready to live in the world, which inevitably, has loss and death. So that's the big argument.
And so as you've been writing it, have you faced any challenges or had any problems?
Well, the main person doing the research on this is Rachel. So I think really she's best placed to talk a bit more about the research and the challenges.
Yeah, so I've been looking at three main areas. I've been looking at the scholarship on grief education, what's being offered in other countries, and the current situation in the UK. And the research is actually overwhelmingly positive. In studies all over the world have found that when you teach children about grief, like Lesel says, they understand the emotions involved in loss, and they're also much more able to talk about death and grief. And globally, the provision is pretty patchy, but it is improving. It's on the syllabus in New Zealand, for instance. It's offered in schools in Spain, and lots of countries are moving towards including it. Here in the UK, as Lesel said, there's currently no requirement to teach children grief, and the gap has been filled by child bereavement charities. And they have, what are fantastic resources for teaching grief, but the schools have to take initiative to take them up and use them. And the main challenge we're finding is that there's just so much information, because no country has a single system. They all have lots and lots of systems. So the work involves a lot of sorting and distilling and knowing when to stop.
So I think that covers the final question that I had for you, but it was, what do you hope that the project will bring for the future, or what plans do you have after the policy paper?
So, as I said, we really want to see a change being made. We'd like to see grief education to be introduced into schools as part of the curriculum. I think more widely, we want to, think a bit more, talk a bit more about grief. In terms of the creativity angle, there's been a lot of really wonderful work done on the physical aspect of grief and trauma. And these are really important. They're crucial. But I think there has been a tendency recently to forget a little bit about the role the imagination plays in grief and in loss. So I want to kind of bring that back a bit more in sort of centrally into the conversation. And more widely, I think we want to destigmatize grief. We want to make it possible for people to have conversations about death, dying, and loss, for people to feel more confident to support one another. And I guess I would just finish with a quotation from Robert Niemeyer, who's a really wonderful academic and psychotherapist. And he notes that we're wired for attachment in a world of impermanence. And I think the wider project on grief is really wanting to think about that as a human experience, our loving bonds of attachment, even as we live with finite physical lives.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak to me today about this really exciting and vitally important project. And please, if you like this, check out the other videos on the Faculty of Arts channel. But thank you both to Lesel and Rachel for today.
Pop.